Evening, everybody. Welcome to our regular Thursday webinar series. This is the Road to the Midterm series. So I am going to be your host tonight. I'm Andrea Miller. I am the founding board member of the Center for Common Ground. Center for Common Ground is a Virginia-based 501c3. We run three different campaigns: Reclaim Our Vote, which many of you are a part of. Our newest campaign is Democracy Centers, and we also are home to the Vote Equality campaign. We are a tech company. We build tools. We build chatbots. Text% was our custom texting solution. And we do a lot of interesting things. We also have a relational texting platform called Vote Force. We are now in 2021 expanding into working in the civic education arena, where we work on both federal and state legislation. So that was my introduction. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is engaging local communities, because the main elections are over. And in the non-federal election year, we are not going to just sit quietly and wait for the next federal election. We are now going back to work with the communities that we engaged on civics. What's important to them? What can we do to help them work toward achieving their goals and getting the community support to achieve the equity that they're looking for? We're also going to spend a small amount of time looking at the Virginia 2021 elections. Boy, is that going to be interesting. And then I'm going to be joined by Stephen Rosenfeld, and we're going to be talking about the war on voting in the states. So our local partners have been talking to us about what is important to them, what do they want to work on. And some of their answers were a little bit surprising. They want to work on rural electric cooperatives, because in rural communities, if you get your power from a rural electric cooperative and you are in the South, you are probably paying a lot more for electricity than someone getting power from one of the large corporate utilities. So people there are interested in letting people know, hey, if you're paying a bill with a rural electric cooperative, you're a member owner. You're not just a customer. You own this thing. And so there's a big, broad education campaign, because when we look at rural electric cooperatives, they're the ones trying to build new coal-fired plants. They're the ones that are fighting solar and other clean energy initiatives. The big corporate types, they understand that ultimately this is where the money is going. And so they're beginning to make their investments now. Since the fastest growing electric companies are rural electric cooperatives, because remember, their territory was defined in the 1930s. What was rural in the 1930s is now in many, many places very, very suburban. There was also a phenomenal interest in legalization of marijuana, but in what they would call on the federal level marijuana justice. So not just legalization, but legalization people that were imprisoned for simple possession, release them and expunge their records so they could begin to get their life back. A really amazing statistic about marijuana arrests. African Americans account for 13% of marijuana usage. However, they account for 85% of marijuana arrest. So if we are going to begin achieving racial equity in the criminal justice system, then we really have to deal with this very, very biased and unfair enforcement of marijuana laws. And the best thing to do is legalize it, tax it, use some of that tax money to help repair the communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. Of course, people in rural communities are interested in raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Many people in rural communities barely make minimum wage. So being able to raise the wage to $15 an hour in rural communities is really, really huge. And we see the fight with the workers, the Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama. And then, of course, the Southern Green New Deal, where that is designed to help communities achieve equity in healthcare, in housing, in education, and most definitely in climate. Because in many instances, when we look at where are the coal-fired plants, where are the biomass and the incinerators, and where are the landfills? Many of them are in poorer southern communities. And so very, very important that we look at not just saying we're going to have clean energy and a clean environment where we live, but we are going to have clean energy and a clean environment everywhere, even in places where we don't live. So this saying, not in my backyard, has to get expanded to not in anybody's backyard. And then, of course, immigration, because we're seeing some very bad immigration laws occurring in many of our southern states. Now, let's talk about Virginia, because we've got an election coming up in Virginia. We have a primary on June 8th, and the general election will be November 2nd. It will be for 3 statewide offices: governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, and all 100 seats of our House of Delegates will also be up for election. All right, now, the Republicans are mounting the most diverse slate of candidates that they have ever mounted. And they are having a convention on May 8th. The Republicans are not having a primary. They are getting the state under control. They want to ensure that the party is able to have some control over who gets the nomination for governor. Now, who do they have running? They have Amanda Chase, who describes herself as Trump in heels, who was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And based on her comments about the insurrection, was censured by the Virginia Senate. We have Kirk Cox, who many would describe as an Eisenhower Republican, who may be one of the people that the party is favoring to run. We have retired Colonel Sergio de la Pena, who is a retired military colonel who is running, very, very conservative. We have a Black woman, Miss Johnson, who was the sheriff in Roanoke. And then we have actually three entrepreneurs, Snyder, Youngkin, and Duran. Now, on the Democratic side, again, it's kind of hard to tell who's who when we're just looking at the pictures. On the Democratic side, we have Jennifer Carroll Foy, a delegate who was one of those impromptu 14 who got elected in 2017 after signing the pledge to not take money from Dominion. She carried the Equal Rights Amendment legislation in the Virginia House. We have Lee Carter. Lee Carter is a Democratic socialist who won re-election and has consistently carried our repeal right to work legislation and other worker legislation. We have Justin Fairfax, who is the sitting lieutenant governor, who unfortunately has a Me Too charge against him. We have our former governor, Governor Terry McAuliffe, who by the Virginia Constitution could not succeed himself. So he let one term go by, and now he is back running again. And then we have Jennifer McClellan, who has been groomed for the role of governor since 2005. Lee Carter is a Green New Deal legislator. We also have Princess Blanding, who is running as an independent. She is the sister of Marcus Peters, who was a young man killed by police while having a serious mental health crisis. For lieutenant governor, and again, these are the Republicans. So the current ones that are running, the only one I know is Mr. Hugo, who is currently elected. But again, this is the first time we have ever seen such a diverse slate of Republicans, and so many of them. Normally there's two. This time there's five. On the Democratic side, we have Hala Ayala, Elizabeth Guzman, Sam Razul, who are Green New Deal legislators. We have a housing building activist type in Mr. Paul Goldman. We have Delegate Mark Levine, Sean Perryman, who is with the Fairfax NAACP. We have Andrea McClellan, who is new to the elected scene. And then we have Mr. Warren. So again, the most diverse slate of candidates we have ever had. Because of the number of candidates, the Democrats have elected not to have a true primary, or probably not. They're going to have a nomination contest, but we aren't quite sure what that means, because in recent memory, nobody remembers them having one. So this one is going to be interesting. And my guess is after the nomination contest, they're probably going to try to whittle it down to three, maybe four candidates, and then they will go into the primary. Again, I'm guessing. We have never had this many candidates running for lieutenant governor. For attorney general, again, We have something for everyone, and Mr. White is brand new. He just appeared today because yesterday when I looked, he wasn't there. And then we have our incumbent, Mark Herring, and Delegate Jay Jones. Delegate Jones just got the endorsement of our current governor, Terry McAuliffe. I'm not positive that it will happen, but it is possible that we could see on the Democratic side and possibly even on the Republican side a full community of color ticket for the statewide offices. So this is pretty darn amazing. Because again, remember, Virginia is still a southern state. We are the gateway to the South, and we are the former capital of the Confederacy. Now, these are just, I'm not even going to say they're highlights. I'm going to say these are lowlights of some of the legislation that has been introduced in the various states. Most of you have heard me talk about Georgia, which is why Georgia didn't even make the list. We all know what's going on in Georgia. They're basically trying to overturn, cancel, stop basically everything that allows voters to vote. Arizona isn't that much better, but I'm grabbing just the lowlights from what we're seeing in the legislators. Arizona wants to remove 200,000 voters from the permanent early voting list, and that's in a state where 2.3 million people are over the age of 60. Tennessee wants to fingerprint all voters, and they are planning for all the county elections offices to go into the fingerprinting business. This should be an interesting unfunded mandate in the great state of Tennessee. Stephen may talk a little bit more about New Hampshire's continuing war on voters for students, or their continuing war on student voters. For students, they cannot claim that the university is their place of residence, and they are going to be requiring ID. However, student ID cannot be used for voting. Washington State has introduced a bill where they want to end vote by mail and only allow in-person voting. Everybody in Washington State votes by mail and has for a very long time. In Texas, they want to prohibit in-person delivery of your vote by mail ballot. And then they're also saying that, all right, if you do have a vote by mail ballot and you decide, no, I'm going to vote in person, then that vote by mail ballot must be canceled and returned before you vote in person. And I love their new constitutional amendment where they are prohibiting the unsolicited distribution of a vote by mail ballot. I already had the New Hampshire one there. So that's the state's war on voting. A really quick upcoming elections before I turn this over to Stephen. Ohio 11, we are still waiting for that cabinet appointment, and they're still saying that election is going to be in May. On May 1st, there will be an election. It will be a jungle general election. There are 23 candidates that are running. We've already had a quick rundown of Virginia. And then in the city of Charlotte, we've got a mayor and 12 city council seats. In Atlanta, we've got a mayor and 16 city council seats. And in Philadelphia, that one didn't make it on my slide. We have a district attorney race. So thank you all very, very much. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to introduce and bring up Stephen Rosenfeld. We had Stephen Rosenfeld as a guest here before. I'm going to ask you all to please turn off your cameras, and I'm going to spotlight Stephen. All right, and there we go. Well, actually, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Hello to everybody. Well, my gosh. What I would like to do is be really brief, and then just we can talk and answer questions to, you know, be responsive to all the folks who are on this call. So let's just start with where we are and think about this for a second. Most of the legislation that we are seeing proposed in these states that would restrict voting rights is in response to an alternative reality that is not acknowledging what really happened in the 2020 election. This is really remarkable and very deeply disturbing, and you all know why. But let's not forget that. If you look at what happened in the 2020 election, there was more paper ballot voting, more audits before certifying winners, um, almost no cybersecurity issues that scaled on and on and on and on. And yet people don't believe the results from on the Republican side. They believe in the easy myths of voter fraud. And that's, again, this comes to an observation. The most powerful Republicans in America probably are not in Congress. They're in these state legislatures where they can pass these laws or these bills that, and they're being animated by the arguments that the Trump campaign and all its allies lost in court for lack of evidence. more than 60 cases. They only won one on a technical thing in Pennsylvania. It was astounding. And yet here we see this happening in a lot of the swing states. Now, it's a mistake to think that the sky is falling everywhere, because it's not. But it is, in the states that decide national elections, the Republicans are it's like the cornered rat theory of government, I call it. They're backed into the corner and they're being really vicious. In contrast, what Andrea was talking about with Virginia is really, really important, because Virginia, in a certain sense, shows what states like Georgia and others could be. Now, Virginia has, has its Democratic majorities because it won a gerrymander case. A quarter of the House House of Delegates were redrawn. They finally had a majority, and they successively basically passed all this state-based legislation that a lot of other states are waiting for HR 1 to tell them to do. So let's just continue with some other trends, and we'll really get to some questions here. A new thing I'm seeing is that some of the most aggressive Republicans, like Texas Governor Greg Abbott, has now begun to attack election officials. And that's really bad, because, whether we like or don't like some folks or some of these laws, as a profession, they have a lot of integrity most of the time, in my experience. I'm not saying everyone is 100% honest, but I would say in the high 90s, that's been my experience, because they believe in voting. So that's really pretty bad. And then another thing we might just think about as we get into the discussion here, because this is the road to the midterms, is some of these states like Georgia, if they adopt some of these laws, and it's very much in flux, and Andrea can talk about how deceitful the legislative process has become there. The laws will take effect immediately, which means that they will affect local elections this year, which means that people on the ground will be able to really see what the impacts are, and will get a first opportunity to try to get ahead or out organize what's going, some of these intended barriers and hurdles. And it's a big pain in the butt, because everyone had to pivot because of COVID before in 2020. but it's an opportunity. It's not widely being recognized by the national media. It's not widely being covered by the national media. Everything is operating at a much higher altitude. But you have mayoral races in Ohio, you have them in Florida, you have them in Georgia, you have them, well, you have the statewide in Virginia and in New Jersey. There's a lot of testing grounds here. And then, we can get into all these bad laws and what has traction and what doesn't have traction. And my filter is there a gubernatorial veto, or does the Republicans, do they have enough power to override vetoes? So we're seeing so much bad stuff coming from like the Republicans on one hand, and then counter proposals by Democrats, like in Michigan, for example. But I don't think a lot of that's going to go anywhere. States like Arizona, things are going to go. Something doesn't seem like good stuff will happen. Texas, the same. Georgia, the same. The other thing I want to just notice, and I'll stop after this, is the rhetoric that is being used by these Republicans is it's really curious to me. I see them stealing I see them stealing basically a lot of rhetoric from Black Voters Matter, Black Lives Matter, talking about equality. And what do they mean by equality? Well, we can't have laws that treat one county one way and another way. So Harris County, Texas, you can't put out all those drop boxes with your millions of voters. You can't have mobile voting sites. You can't do all these things to accommodate people. You have to have the same as a little county in the West Texas that has 2,000 people. It's not just Texas, it's Ohio, it's other places. And so, you've got this, these contrived language based on seemingly reasonable principles. And it's really, it's becoming part of the landscape and the justification. So I'll stop there and let's just have a conversation, Andrea. We'll just go from here.
All right. Stephen, in your latest article, Permanent Campaigns, how is this impacting what we're seeing with all this legislation in all these different states?
Well, what we're seeing is that the 2020 election isn't over. And it's in a lot of these states that will decide national majorities in Congress, in the states that lead the litigation when it came to opposing. We're seeing it now. What's the latest Republican litigation? It's pushing back on the taxation provisions in the relief bill, saying, "Oh my God, you're telling us we can take all this money from you, but we can't use it to cut other people's taxes just because we feel like we want to claim it." This is the kind of nonsense that emerges. So what happens is it's always a permanent culture of fighting and battling, but it used to not so much be that around voting. And that's in recent years, it's turned into that. So that's why I'm calling it a permanent campaign, which is a phrase that came out of the 70s, by the way. It really it was generated by political consultants and pollsters who basically said, well, if you want to run for office and you want to win, you've got to be raising money every day. You got to be doing this every day. What ends up happening is the tactics and the battle become more important than the substance of of the business you're supposed to be doing, the people's business. And you see this. And so the reason I wrote this article that just labeled it as such is because the notion of pushing back on a permanent campaign, people say, oh, it's the voting wars. It hasn't really been discussed in the federal response. I haven't really seen it, being come up in when we're talking about HR 1 or Senate Bill 1. And it's a pretty good reason, to my mind, to actually justify a federal response, because you just can't have this ping-ponging back and forth over the neck. Because what happens is election systems are like military operations. They really are they're complicated and they have to run right, and they don't pivot quickly. And if you keep changing the rules every 2 years, you're going to lose people who are administering them. You already have poll workers who say, I don't want to be intimidated and attacked by these crazies. And I mean, you have these laws that are passing again. in Iowa, penalizing poll workers for making simple mistakes, potential $10,000 fines. This is completely nuts. And so the thing about this is you've got to sort of say there's something. I mean, maybe this is naive, but I would like to think that, there's some consensus around, a basis for representative government. You don't change the rules every 2 years. And that's kind of where we're at with this stuff. And that's kind of what we're seeing. And so that's what I was focusing on.
Now, we've talked a lot here, or I have, about HR1, the For the People Act. I'm going to ask you to talk about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and what that is going to bring. So what do we get with that?
Well, the John Lewis Advancement Act is basically to restore what the Supreme Court took out of the Voting Rights Act in its 2013 decision, Shelby County versus Holder. And what did it take out? Okay, it's one thing to say it's the enforcement provisions, but let's talk about what that really, really means and what the impact really was, because I don't think people really understand this. Okay, so before the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, there was the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and there were previous Civil Rights Acts. And before that, there was Brown versus the Board of Education, which was integrating schools. And what happened was that even though you could, even though schools were integrated, minorities, Blacks in the South primarily, did not have political power. You don't get power by just integrating schools. You get power from voting. And the power you get from voting is not just to vote for ballot, but to put people into office. And then you have the possibility that those people will make decisions that will affect your lives. And what the South didn't want was Black people making decisions over white people's lives. So what happened was Lyndon Johnson asked the Attorney General to write the strongest possible enforcement provisions that would prevent all kinds of bureaucratic tricks that would try to discourage people from voting. And the standard for that was, if some change in law or policy makes it harder to vote than it was previously, it's going to be vetoed, it's going to be rejected. And by the way, the state of Virginia just adopted on a state level that exact standard. So what happened was, in the past decade, a lot of legal scholars were saying, Congress, you really better update this formula because we're not living in the same world as the 60s, and they didn't do it. And then you've had John Roberts on the court, infamously saying, well, we've mostly dealt with the issue of race in this country. We don't need this anymore. We don't need this standard that can be used to judge and roll, and what happened was in 2013, after that was repealed, within days, you had states like the North Carolina legislature, you had Texas, you had I think you had these states basically just rushing through stricter voter ID standards and all kinds of things to basically try to make it harder for people of color, low-income people, older people, people who are perceived as Democrats to vote. And we've been living with this. And now what young people will say, oh, well, by the way, we had the highest presidential turnout. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is we would have even higher turnout were it not for these hurdles that people have to engineer, educational materials, campaign materials, public service announcements, and all that such to get around and make sure you don't fall into one of these traps. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, maybe I'm garbling the title, would basically restore that. Now, the question is, with all this legislation, and Andrew, you can talk about this, it goes back to HR1, is if these bills are not retroactive or don't take effect, have an effective date that is, like as of January 1 of this year, that may mean that some of the bad stuff that's being passed before a bill like this comes into effect will still be in effect. So it's, what's your take on that?
Well, I think that's interesting because in my mind, it is setting the standard and saying any state that wanted to pass legislation, if they are under pre-clearance, which is really what, if they restore Section 4 does. It's as if states do this, this is the formula for figuring out who is under pre-clearance. So if they reinstate the pre-clearance formula, Georgia would most definitely be one of those pre-clearance states, and all the other states that I mentioned. Then any new law they wanted to pass would be subject to pre-clearance by the Justice Department. And the Justice Department would say, no, you're not doing that now. I'm a little squidgy on, does that roll back any bad legislation that they have already passed, which could explain why they're in such a bum's rush to pass this stuff. There's no federal election until 2022.
Well, the bum rush, it comes, and I don't know the answer to that legal question, by the way. I'm not a lawyer, but the bum rush comes because it's a 50-50 Senate, and somebody might die and somebody might get appointed. And, it's really interesting. Progressives are always told to wait. Dr. King was told to wait. And there is no good time ever to pass any political reform. And when I first got into covering politics, I was a money and politics reporter for NPR and Christian Science Monitor Radio. And, and this is when Mitch McConnell said, oh, all we need is transparency. And now, of course, he won't allow that. But the thing is, if people are elected to office, they think that the system is working just fine because they're in office. It works for them. So there's really not much of an incentive to change that. And we have seen this, I'm not exaggerating, for decades. So what's the reason for a bum rush here? Well, there are several. Of course, HR 1 really is a compendium of every Democratic bill that didn't pass since 2005 or 2006. It goes back to Rush Holt's election security bills, I was told by some people. That's 2006. So there's a lot of stuff in there that's looking backwards. I wish I had more stuff in there looking forwards, but nothing is perfect. But the thing about it is, when are they going to ever get this thing done? And it's not just this, by the way. They can't get a bill like this through. They're not going to get infrastructure reform. They're not going to get immigration reform. They're not going to get a whole bunch of stuff. And the way politics usually works, I mean, I've seen this over decades, is that, well, okay, your side wins, your side loses. The winning side gets its shot to do a few things, but they don't dismantle until Trump. This what happened beforehand, and then it's your turn, and then it kind of goes back and forth, and usually the worst fears of people, the sky is falling stuff doesn't happen, and stuff you don't plan on does happen, and this is how I'm trying to think about this voting stuff. I mean, really, it's just mind-boggling that we completely pivoted and had a very successful election with mailed out voting and early voting and addressing issues. I mean, listen, if there was fraud, okay, here's this one statistic. The Heritage Foundation, which is about to spend $10 million on voter messaging in these swing states, they have this much vaunted database where of election fraud convictions. See how many people were convicted of voting fraud in 2020 nationwide in a year where, what was 150 million people voted, 160 million? Five. And this is what they're spending $10 million on. It's not about this, but it basically goes back to the age-old story that the ruling classes, and in the southern states, it means what the white gentry, don't want people of color making decisions that could affect their lives. They don't want them, and this is at the local level more than it is at the state level. And this is why, we're talking about, the races in Virginia, but it's also Georgia this year. You have these mayoral races in these states, and in the counties that elected Warnock and elected, Ossoff and elected Joe Biden, you still only had like, for Democrats and progressives, we're only getting 45% of the vote. They hadn't crossed, we're talking about school board and county commissioners and even sheriffs and DAs. That's the wave that really will bring change. I mean, for example, think about this. Jury pools are drawn from voter rolls. Well, why were there all white juries in the South? Because there were no black voters. And how are you going to deal with all this, the violence, police violence, if you don't have mixed juries? And it just goes on and on. And so I'll stop. But,
Well, that leads me directly into, again, why we're pivoting somewhat in our work to go back and make certain we are supporting local communities, because yes, all the local communities do want to protect voting rights, but that is not all that they want or need to get out of voting. So, right, they're looking at these smaller elections, they're looking at city council stuff where they want to be able, and again, depending on the community, to have a voice in how the school budget gets allocated so that the white schools don't get all the money, and then the black and or Hispanic schools don't get anything. And people are going, oh my God, we can see the change beginning to happen.
yeah. And this year, by the way, it's going to be, it's not a trial run, but it is going to sort of be the first lap around the block to see what really needs to happen, in 2022. And and because these laws that are being passed, most of them are going to take effect this year. So you have these mayoral races in Cleveland, Ohio. That Ohio's going to, it's going to have a big Senate race. You have, Georgia's Georgia, Virginia's Virginia, Florida. It's Florida, where the Democrats basically pretended that they were going to put money in to try to be like a thanks for Trump and didn't do anything. And then now people are complaining, like, why don't Latinos vote Democratic? I mean, they didn't put anything in there. They didn't have anything on the ground. What's going to happen this? So, these are all Texas. These are all. This is not insignificant or trivial stuff.
Well, I'm seeing a couple of questions in chat that are really good. And again, people are asking about, will the new federal laws have an impact on state laws that were already passed? HR1, the For the People Act, definitely will, because that will basically establish a base on what elections need to look like in states. So, since a lot of states are trying to say, we're going to end no excuse absentee voting. If you're going to vote by mail, you're going to have one of a really small list of excuses. Well, the For the People Act says all 50 states will have no excuse absentee voting. That's just the way it's going to be. Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama don't have early voting. They did, Alabama and South Carolina got early voting in 2020 purely because of the pandemic. Once the pandemic is basically gone, they go back to you vote on election day unless you meet a very narrow criteria to vote early. Whereas the For the People Act establishes all states are going to have 15 days of early voting. And that's a base, that's a bottom. That would have no impact on Virginia having 45 days of early voting. This is the least of what you're going to have. And now I think a lot of people probably remember in 2018 when Florida had a constitutional referendum. Are we going to allow people with felony convictions? And Florida had something like um, 2 million people with felony convictions in their past and they couldn't vote. Are we going to allow people to vote? And 64% of Florida voters said yes. When people are out of prison, that's fine. They're going to be able to vote. We're good with that. And then the Florida legislature said, whoa, not so fast. All right, you will be able to vote once you've paid your fines and fees. So the For the People Act says, no, 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 there's no fine paying, fee paying, or any of that stuff. When you are released from prison, in your exit packet will be a voter registration form, because a lot of people, even in states where they can vote immediately upon release from prison, mistakenly believe that they will never be able to vote at all because they've heard this from somebody in some other state. So For the People Act will definitely have an impact in that it will nullify a lot of these laws. And what I love about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is, and now we stop people from passing new ones. So that, well, anyway, that's my take, and I'm sticking with it.
There's a good question here from Ed Rusky from Mill Valley about, will there be a clash between state and federal laws? And what happens when states run, federal elections at the same time as local elections? And generally what happens is that most states, unless they're run by pretty extreme right wingers, and Kansas was an example of this for a while, and Arizona a little bit too, but it's kind of backed off somewhat. Don't want to have separate elections and separate rules for federal and state. They tried to actually do this voter registration forms in a couple of these states, and it didn't really fly. But the problem with this stuff is that the opponents of participation and inclusion will file lawsuits, and it will take years before these things go through the process from state and federal court all the way up until they're settled. And while that delay tactic happens, it's the same as it ever was. And of course, we can expect some of that with HR 1. Some of the constitutional scholars have said, well, there are things that are clearly, Congress is clearly empowered to do certain things around presidential elections and around, equal, voting rights, for the former slaves, for Black people, for women, for young people, people over 18. It's in the Constitution. There's amendments. And then when you get beyond that, it becomes a question of how friendly is the Supreme Court? And there's a recent case, we'll get into the details, coming out of Arizona that was heard that goes after another section of the Voting Rights Act, which has to do with a couple of things. And the question there really comes down to, are legislators going to get the final say, or will there be a federal standard? And the Republicans have been pushing this states' rights things anew, and they're hoping they're going to get a decision out of the new, the Trump majority court. And we'll see what it is. It remains to be seen. But in general, most states, not all, don't want to have separate standards, separate rules. It just is too much work and it's too confusing.
Virginia would be one of those interesting states because Virginia separates its state and local elections. It has them totally in a different year. So theoretically, if a state were that determined that they were going to suppress the vote, they could, depending upon what their constitution says, they could separate state and federal elections and hold them either at different times in the same year. That would be beyond a nightmare. they would probably go to something like what Virginia did, which is its own form of voter exhaustion, because we are having an election every year and it never stops. And
Yeah,
that's
the other thing that
hard for people.
the other thing that should be mentioned here is, the Republicans are really going to are likely to do a number on their own voters in a lot of these states by passing these rollbacks of voting by mail. And I mean, for example, we're seeing this in Florida right now. This is really, really interesting. Um, Florida has Florida has an interesting system where the county supervisors of elections are elected officials. So they're not like your typical election official that is a civil servant who doesn't want to say anything to offend a political figure, and that's why you don't hear them pushing back on these attacks. These folks are elected, and they're basically pushing back hard right now on their governor, who says we don't want to use drop boxes anymore. We think we should stop using them, and it's completely ridiculous because it's a state where a lot of the seniors and older people use them, and just like Arizona, the Republicans there want to take people off of this permanent absentee list and require them to reapply more often. And again, we're talking about a state where I think it was like 80 or 90% of the people there voted by mail. Like, what are they really thinking? Well, they're not really thinking. They're being driven by this alternative reality of what Trump, and Sidney Powell and the others were telling them. It doesn't mean it won't hurt people on our side, the people who believe in inclusion, but on the and are willing to accept representative government that's honestly and legitimately elected. But that's probably going to happen too, by the way, if that stuff flies. And in the meantime, it's such an astounding distraction, to have to deal with all these, I mean, Andrew, just think about what happened in Georgia this week. A 2-page bill becomes a 90-page bill. It pops up on the day of the mass shooting, the tornado threats, and school closings. No one's paying attention, so let's race through and not have a hearing. This is how they're doing it.
Yes, yes. We have been amazed watching the Georgia legislature, how fast they have been able to turn. So this morning, SB 202, the bill you're referring to, like you said, was a little 2-page bill. By this afternoon, it's a 93-page bill that's going up for a vote at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it's like, what are these people doing? In some ways, it is really, really amazing, their ability to literally cut and paste this legislation. What happened to the notion of, number one, the legislators really need an opportunity to read the bill, think about the bill, and then have discussions about it. I mean, we're talking about, in the morning it was one thing, and in the afternoon it has morphed into something else. So yes, um, it's almost impossible to imagine, but it is nearly 9 o'clock. So, wow, time has just totally flown. So, Stephen, thank you so much. I love our discussions. They are fun, they are wonderful. I learned something, and I am sure all of our attendees learned something. People were talking about these statehood. Yes. So there
Yeah.
are the 3 bills that ultimately we will have to have a path and a plan to move through the Senate. The For the People Act is already there. Jeff Merkley and Amy Klobuchar introduced it officially yesterday. After that bill is done, then the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which has not yet been introduced in the House. They are waiting and watching certain legislative things and looking at things in the court. They want to be certain that the way they write that bill, it will withstand the scrutiny of the court, and the court won't immediately throw it out. So we have that bill, and then we have statehood for the city of Washington, D.C. So it is going to be a very, very, very busy time. I have it up. I can probably let people sign it early. Um, going to give it to you. We're not sending it out yet on an official email because it has not been released. But here is our advocacy alert on the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. All right. So that will be one of the links that you will get when Nancy sends out the email tomorrow. And then when DC statehood is ready to be introduced, we will also do an alert. And we set up our alerts so that they're very, very easy. People know their name and their address, and then we will look up their legislators, the letters, the tweets, if you're on Twitter, the script to say on the phone, they are all pre-done. So thank you all so very much for joining me. Oh, wait a minute. I put it in the chat. I need to tell you. We had something of a win for a moment in Georgia. Things changed really, really fast in the legislature. A really bad bill, SB 241 in the House, that had an end to no excuse absentee voting. There was so much pushback. They removed that part of the bill. They literally changed it. We have sent more than 40,000 emails into the Georgia state legislature. We have patched through more than 3,000 phone calls to Georgia legislators. They have never seen anything like this. And while we may not be able to actually stop them, we have given them pause. And I always tell people, know what winning looks like. Sometimes you win a battle that sets you up to win the next battle. So we have established that Georgia is definitely working very hard to suppress the vote. So if anybody were to ask, it was this, and then here is an entire history of everything they've done. So thank you all. Have a wonderful night, and I will see you next week, not as host, but I'll see you next week for our Southern Voices. So take care, everybody. Bye bye.